What a great honor it is for me to appear among such a distinguished panel of diplomats and political figures, rabbis, and most of all, those of you who lived what we're talking about today. I've learned already so much from listening to the testimonies. I was simply not aware, even as one who has cared about this problem for a long time, of some of the specific details that I've heard from previous speakers. I want to begin by bringing you back to the fall of 1967, shortly after the Six-Day War. The United States ambassador to the United Nations in this building was Arthur Goldberg, for whom I had served as a law clerk several years earlier. And Arthur Goldberg, when you served as his law clerk, you served as his law clerk for life. He never let you off the hook. Until the day he died, he was calling on me to help him write speeches and do memoranda for him. And during the fall of 1967, he asked me to come to New York and work with him on what became Resolution 242 of the Security Council, which was essentially the peace treaty that ended the 1967 war and stated the legal framework for establishing peace. And you all know about the great debate that occurred about the word territory, whether or not the resolution would ask Israel to return all the territories captured in the Six-Day War in exchange for peace and recognition, the territories. And Justice Goldberg, along with the ambassador from Great Britain, fought hard to eliminate the words all and the, to reject both the French and the Russian, the Soviet renditions, and to keep the word territories, and announced from the podium of the United Nations and from the State Department that generally recognized Israel's right to hold on to certain of the territories that were captured in a defensive war, those essential to its defense, and that continues to become an issue that will have to be resolved if there is to be peace, which is why Israel can never be asked to return to the 67 borders. The United Nations is now hearing speeches, you'll probably hear one this week, in which Israel will be asked to return to the 1947 borders. But the 1967 borders obviously would require Israel to begin a negotiation without having the Kotel, the access road to Hebrew University, the Jewish Quarter. And that's not the way it's going to begin, and even the President of the United States now recognizes that. What is often forgotten is that there was another debate about 242 that directly relates to the issue that is before us today. And that is that the Soviet Union also wanted to add the word Palestinian to the word refugees as it appears in Resolution 242. You'll recall 242 does say that there must be a just settlement of the refugee problem. Justice Goldberg and the British ambassador and the United States State Department again fought against that and prevailed. And the resolution, as ultimately adopted, makes no reference to Palestinian refugees. It keeps open the issue of refugees in general. And that led Justice Goldberg to make the following statement, which is part of the judicial record, part of the legislative record of 242. He said, the resolution addresses the objective of achieving a just settlement of the refugee problem. This language presumably refers both to Arab and Jewish refugees, for about an equal number of each abandoned their homes as the result of the several wars. That statement was not simply off the cuff made by Justice Goldberg. I know that for a fact. He had to clear that with the State Department, and it was cleared with the White House. And it was a very important part of the ultimate resolution that led to 242. So those cynics, both in Israel and outside of Israel, and there are some, and I've read op-ed pieces who say that this is a new issue that is cynically being urged on the world as a justification for Israel not coming to the peace process, simply don't know their history. This has been an issue of great concern to the United States and an issue of concern, at least to the United Nations at the time that 242 was resolved. And it's very important that we understand that the status of Jewish refugees from Arab countries has equal status under international law as defined by 242 of the United Nations. There is no preference in that resolution for one group of refugees over the other. And if H.R. 6242 is ultimately enacted and made into law, it will have equal status under the law of the United States of America. 6242 actually incorporates this legislative history and the statements by Justice Goldberg and others made at the United Nations. And so it's very important that we demand legal, equal status for the Jewish refugees as for the Palestinian refugees. In fact, and in history, there is no equality. The situation faced by Jews in Arab and Muslim countries was far worse than that faced by Arabs in Israel, as proved by one simple fact among many others, and the fact that over 1 million Arabs today remain in Israel, live in Israel, as first-class citizens with equal rights under Israeli law, with complete access to the Israeli Supreme Court, with representation in the Knesset, while you can count on a small number of hands the number of Jews, mostly elderly, who remain in Arab and Muslim countries around the world in constant peril and risk of their lives. So in fact and in history, there is in fact not equality. There is no comparison. There were no pogroms in Israel against Arabs or Palestinians. There were no Nuremberg-type laws enacted in Israel. There were no hostages taken by Israel. There were no hangings of Arabs by Israel. There was no confiscation of billions of dollars of bank accounts and other movable assets by Israel. And there is no Israeli Hanan Ashrari who is going around the world mendaciously trying to rewrite the history and the historical truth. As Professor Kotler mentioned, and this is very important, in Israel today, the Palestinian refugee problem is part of the narrative of peace. Children are taught about it. Palestinian Arabs are permitted to celebrate Nakba and days of grief reflecting their personal tragedies and individual tragedies. That doesn't happen today in the Palestinian narrative, which is led by Hanan Ashrari. There are no Jewish refugees who blow up airplanes, buses, or synagogues who engage in terrorism. Instead, we have conferences. We teach, we learn, we remember. Moreover, Israel, at great expense to a poor, struggling economy, settled Jewish refugees, while rich Arab nations used Palestinian refugees as political footballs in an effort to delegitimate Israel, as Ashrari is trying to do today in regard to Jewish refugees. It's backfiring, interestingly enough. When you read Ashrari's nonsense, and it really is nonsense, the one thing she does acknowledge is that she says that the Jews can't be refugees because Israel is in fact the homeland of the Jewish people. Hooray! Hooray! Finally, Hanan Ashrari, in order to make a political point, is become a Zionist and espousing the Israeli narrative, but she does it for cynical reasons. Finally, as we've heard, and we will hear more, Jews have lived in Arab and Muslim countries far longer than the Palestinian refugees lived in the areas they left. As you know, there are great debates among demographers and others how long Palestinian refugees lived in what is now Israel. Was it a few years? Was it a few dozen years? They moved a few miles. It is a tragedy. But it simply doesn't compare in magnitude to the uprooting of a population that has lived and made home and made successes of Iraq and Yemen and Lebanon and you name the countries for so many years. There's simply no comparison in terms of the uprooting that occurred in the two groups. The major difference is that Jews understood their Bible. They understood their heritage when it says, treat the refugee kindly because we were strangers in the land of Egypt. We learned. Jews looked forward. Jews made new lives. When you think of the great successes and contributions that Jews from Arab and Muslim countries have made to the United States of America, you have been one of the most successful and important refugee and immigrant groups in the history of this country. If other immigrant and refugee groups that achieved the success and the patriotism and the service that you have contributed to our country, and that you have contributed to Israel, and that you have contributed everywhere you have gone, because you've looked forward. You have accepted the biblical narrative of Ubacharta b'chayim, choose life, look forward. And instead, Palestinian refugees, used as political footballs by Arab and Muslim countries, have looked backward and have decided to take revenge and have decided not to move forward, have decided to tie themselves to refugee camps and not try to make lives for themselves. That is a major, major difference. Look, in life as in law, there are statutes of limitations. There have been millions of refugees from all over the world. Think about the Germans from Sudetenland. Think about the Germans who had to move out of Königsberg, and which was taken over by the Soviet Union. Think of all the refugees from India and Bangladesh and Pakistan. In almost every case, they have made new lives. Why have the Palestinians not made new lives for themselves? The answer is simple, and it's two letters: UN. This building is primarily responsible for the perpetuation of the Palestinian refugee problem. If there are statutes of limitations, and some claim there are for Jewish refugees from Arab countries, surely there are statutes of limitation for Palestinian refugees from Israel. And there are some who claim, cynically, Hashrawi is among them, but there are many others, who claim that the Jews from Arab countries are not refugees. And this is the most cynical argument I have ever heard. You're not refugees because you don't want to return to Libya, because you don't want to return to Iran. Shame on you! Why don't you want to return to Iran? Why don't you want to return to Libya? Can you imagine this argument having been made in 1943 about German Jews? You're not really refugees, German Jews. Why don't you go back to Berlin? Polish Jews, you're not refugees. Why don't you go back to Auschwitz? Why don't you go back to Treblinka? The very idea of suggesting that Jews who would love to go back to their homelands, if their homelands were truly homelands and welcoming and democratic, do not want to go back to countries that would today butcher them, as an argument that they're not refugees. Shame on anybody who makes that kind of argument. The other major difference, of course, and has been stated previously brilliantly by Professor Kotler, is that the international community has elevated the weakest refugee claim, the Palestinian refugee claim, which is the weakest claim in the world today. Of all the refugee issues, it is the weakest claim, historically, politically, empirically, morally, and in every other way. It has elevated it not only to the point above every other claim, but the very word refugee today, with a capital R, means only one thing, Palestinians, and has denigrated one of the strongest claims, Jewish refugees from Arab countries, to a level of oblivion, particularly here in this building. We are here today to change all of that, and we must change it. We must change it in the name of justice. We must change it in the name of humanity. If people do not believe the history, let there be established an international commission of objective historians to take testimony from all sides and to release a report, an objective report, a report based on emet, on truth, on tzedek, on justice, on reality, on history. We are not afraid of history. We are not afraid of the truth. There are some who argue that this is a new issue, that it's a new issue that has been created or manufactured in the interests of Israeli political considerations. They are wrong. This is an issue that many of us, many of you, many of us have cared about since the very, very beginning. I became sensitive to this issue, as I said, in 1967. Since that time, I have represented immigrants from various countries, particularly Iran, Iraq, Egypt, and Libya, in an effort to secure justice. That justice has not been forthcoming. It is so important that we remember, because that's what Jews do. We remember. We never forget. We must demand justice. We must demand equality. We must demand due process. We must demand the sympathetic attention of the United Nations and of the world. We must see the enactment of this very important law that's pending in Congress. We must see hearings held. We must follow the lead of Canada. I wish we had more Irwin Cutlers in the United States Congress, in the United States Senate, and in all positions of power throughout the world. But we must emulate what you have begun. Let the world learn the truth. Let the world hear the entire historical record. And in the end, tzedek, justice, will prevail. Thank you very much.